Tasmania's west coast. Remote, rugged, mountainous and forested. Only the most persistent pioneers who braved hardship and worked with the land to find solutions succeeded in this wild place. Today, this spirit lives on. Amongst the west coast's forests and mountains, small pockets of enterprise exist. Delivered by feats of ingenuity, modern pioneers created a treasure. Renewable energy generated through the island's hydroelectric scheme. Nestled in isolated valleys beneath the dark, ice-cold waters created by the scheme's dams, there is another treasure. Ancient forests. These flooded forests have stood dormant, preserved in the dark, waiting to be rediscovered. When pilot and entrepreneur David Wise flew over Lake Pyman in 2011, seeing the treetops piercing the surface, he wondered how much timber could be down there, and could the timber be recovered? David and his business partner Andrew Morgan spent 3 years investing in research, quality testing and technology to find out. In 2015, they launched one of the world's first fully mechanised underwater logging operations. Hydrowood.
So the concept of Hydrowood really came around when my business partner David was flying over the Tasmanian Highland Lakes, and he saw these grey ghostly trees sort of sticking out of the water. And he'd been to British Columbia a few years before and had saw them salvaging what they call sinkers over there, and saw that they were still fresh and that they were using them and commanding a premium because they had this story and provenance to them. So I guess we sort of thought, well, why can't we do that here? Why can't these trees that have been underwater for 30 years in a dark, cold, anaerobic environment, why wouldn't they still be okay and why couldn't we use them? And up until that point, people had looked at these trees and just considered them to be rotting fish habitat, really. You look at them and then they're nothing spectacular, and a lot of people would just consider them a waste material that were probably just degrading. So really the concept around Hydrowood was asking the question of why can't we, or why can't we go and look at these trees and test them and see whether they're okay. So that question of why or why not permeates through a lot of our thinking in terms of these ideas around innovation and being entrepreneurial. And I guess there's a bit of a stubborn streak to both of us in that we don't like to be told what we can't do. So if someone tells us you can't do that, we're probably going to go and give it a go. In terms of the lakes, when we first did a feasibility study, we identified 5 lakes in Tasmania that was suitable. So these were all lakes that were constructed during the hydroelectric scheme period, so the 1960s, 70s and the early 80s. And so all these dams basically had, they were forested valleys, and a dam went in one end, the water levels rose, inundated the trees died and they sat there. We picked Lake Pyman for a number of reasons. One, there's a lot of trees there. It's a very steeply incised valley. So lots of large trees were left. It's close to other mining services on the west coast of Tasmania. So in terms of utilising or seeking services to maintain our equipment, it was suitable. And it's pretty large. So it's about 2,500 hectares in size. But it's about 250 kilometres from our sawmill, and we use a contracting mill in the Delavrain Mole Creek area to harvest to saw our timber. In terms of the logistical issues, there were a number of them. So the road in to Lake Pyman is known as the Argent Track. It was a fairly degraded forestry road. We spent probably about $500,000 on upgrading that road and making it ready to be able to utilise it for log trucks. We also had to open up the landing and build a landing pad there. And you've got a lake which has a varying lake level. So we actually had to use geotextile materials in the landing and then overlay that with gravel so that the whole landing pad actually floats, because the water level can come up and sit just below that water level, that landing level. In terms of other logistical issues, finding staff to work down there, just building the machinery and having that maintained. As I said, being on the west coast and near the mining towns of Rosebery and Tulla helped, because there's a lot of mining on that west coast area, and so heavy machinery is pretty common, but it's still some pretty big challenges. The other issue was green tape, red tape, in terms of logistics. Just working with government partners like Hydro Tasmania, Sustainable Timbers Tasmania, government, Crown Land Services. We'd have leases and licences with all those varying entities. We have a licence with Hydro Tasmania, which means that we have to have an operating environmental management plan and an impact assessment done. We also operate under the forest practices system in Tasmania, which means we have a forest practices plan. So whenever anyone asks us about compliance, it's not simple. And if anyone else wants to think about doing something like Hydrowood, I usually push the large pile of papers. There's probably a couple of reams of A4 paper in the compliance documents that we've had to put together over the years. I guess when we first started, it's probably not too different than where it's ended up. We had this vision, I suppose, of being able to harvest and extract and mill specialty timbers, so Tasmanian specialty timbers. The ones that your listeners would know: celery top pine, Blackwood myrtle, Huon pine, sassafras. I guess the one that has developed over time, and that is Tas oak or the eucalypt species down here, or the different eucalypt species down here. We didn't really focus on that too much to start with, but with the ongoing constraints in the native forest sector around Australia, we've realised that there is actually a market there for a recovered salvage product in that Tas oak space, and that's probably been our biggest seller to date. We've probably played with different supply chains and different models, from selling logs or auctioning logs all the way through to finished boards and panels, veneer on panels, dressed all round boards, rough sawn boards, and sort of everything in between. And I think, as we've matured, our thinking has matured, and where we are able to best serve the markets, and that's probably in that rough sawn and dressed board place, with it more of a view around custom or bespoke milling where needed or where requested. terms of the timber and how we treat it once we've pulled it out, we harvest the timber. It stays on the landing on Lake Pyman until we're ready to mill it. Goes up to the mill. It's then milled in a very standard way. Anyone who's been to a sawmill, it's exactly the same process. It's racked, ready for air drying. It then gets stored in a warehouse. That's probably a little different. A lot of people store their material outside, but we took a view that this is expensive material to extract, and we wanted to give it the best timber husbandry that we could. And by putting it in a warehouse, we can control those conditions a little more than being left to the environment, particularly around sun check and wind. So we really wanted to slow down the drying a little bit, because that water tends to want to rush out quickly, and that can cause degrade. And then in terms of a kiln drying process, so it's roughly 12 months from air dry going into the kilns, and we kiln dry to Australian standards. So you're looking at sort of an 8 to 12% moisture content coming out of the kiln. So really the chain of from log to sawn board isn't much different to just a standard terrestrially harvested timber. In terms of the different species, I think we've got 6. So Tas oak, myrtle, Blackwood, celery top pine, blackheart, sassafras, and huon pine. We do occasionally get a little bit of leatherwood, but nothing of commercial volume. And the same with huon. It's less than 1%. We get the occasional huon pine log, which is very nice and exciting, but it's a very small component. In terms of being able to identify them, you can really only identify a couple of species as they're in the water. Once they've been cut with the saw on the machine, you can generally tell whether they're what species they are. And then obviously once they get to the landing, they're identified. They're measured in the cube and then tagged, and then they're ready to head off to the mill. So my background and Dave's background is that, I guess my background's zoology and botany. Did a degree in those many years ago now, but we still run a business called SFM. It's an plantation asset management company. So we manage a pine estate in the south of Tasmania called Blenheim Estate, which supplies about 65% of the fibre that goes into all the newsprint in Australia. We also manage a blue gum and pine asset over in the Green Triangle, as well as a new project in the north of Tasmania doing carbon farming. So, prior to Hydrowood, back in 2012, we were doing similar things. We were doing a lot of harvesting of private land and private plantations. So, putting logs on trucks was a pretty common and well understood theme for our business. The bits that we needed to learn about were the underwater piece and extracting the timber and getting it onto the barge, but also the milling and drying bit. They were the steep learning curves, and probably the milling and drying bit was probably more of a challenge than the actual logistics of getting the log out of the water. In terms of the appeal for the high-end furniture makers, I think there's a couple of points that why people are drawn to the Hydrowood story. I think there's a piece around the provenance, this idea that the timber is underwater and has been lost but then rediscovered. But also there's also a sustainability or an ethically sourced story that's I guess linked to that. And then even more probably is around the Tasmanian timber on the Tasmanian west coast. And I think what we've done well is we've put some really interesting stories out there through the media about this rugged west coast operation, and really played up the personalities that make up Hydrowood, and I think it all adds to this sort of richness of a story. You'll see the occasional slab of red gum or material that's come out of a church, like church pews or church floorboards, and that story gets continued and people use that story as a selling point. And I think Hydrowood's no different, that this novel approach to extracting timber and where it's come from adds to the richness of it. So I think there's a number of layers there that seem to make it have an appeal to not just the high-end furniture makers, but the architects and any furniture maker. And I think the other piece probably is that some of those species are now becoming very scarce. And so to get your hands on some celery top pine or some blackheart sassafras is getting harder and harder. And we've kind of made a point of making that available or more available to the masses, particularly on the mainland.
There's an essential environmental custodianship now. So how do we sustainably use the resources that we have? How do we express through design the most beautiful articulation of those timbers in form? And how do we celebrate the local in a sustainable fashion? And those are very, very important undertakings for us that we are committed to. I think we made a mistake early on. We did use some exotic timber, and for many years now, actively looking to avoid that and use local timber because it talks to the story that we're telling, which is essentially an Australian one.
In terms of the equipment, so we use it's a 45-ton excavator. It's a Caterpillar excavator, which was purchased from William Adams here in Tasmania, with some modifications, obviously, and a 140-ton barge, which is constructed in 3 pieces. And on that barge, it has 3 thrusters that drop down into the water. And so we built the whole concept around being able to build that machinery and that platform here in Hobart, using some advanced manufacturing partners here, and then be able to pull that apart and take it to the lake, with the view that once we've used, we've exhausted the supply in Lake Pyman, we can pull that all apart again, put it on 5 or 6 semi-low loaders and move it to the next lake. So generally, all the machinery was sourced where we could from Tasmania, or manufactured here. So Taylor Brothers, just here in Hobart, constructed the barges. William Adams up in Somerset, did the excavator. Most of the excavator pieces from Caterpillar came from, I think, Mexico and Thailand. That's where they construct them. But then it was put together here. Our log barges, so the barges that we use as little forwarders or log trucks on the water, were built just down the road here at Electrona. And the little tugboat that we use actually was sourced out of Queensland. It was running in the canals around the Gold Coast, pushing the garbage barges around up there. So we like to think that we've taken it out of a fairly mundane job and put it into somewhere fairly picturesque, and it has a happy life plying the waters of Lake Pyman. How much timbers in Lake Pyman gets asked a lot. We think we've got somewhere between 5 to 10 years worth of resource left in Lake Pyman alone. Obviously, that's dependent on how fast we cut it and how hard. We've got a view that we don't want to overcut this. We don't want to flood the market with this material. We want to treat it as precious material. So we have a view in terms of that lifespan of the operation. We also don't want to move too quickly. We really want to squeeze as much out of Lake Pyman as we can, because we spend a lot of money on fixed assets. There's been a fairly hefty capital spend there in terms of roads and landings and infrastructure. So the longer we can spend there, the more we can squeeze out of that equipment and that infrastructure. And then going forward, we've identified 3 or 4 other lakes in Tasmania that would be suitable. So we're not going to run out in Tasmania anytime soon.
We absolutely adore our terrace and courtyard. We're the only apartment on the block to have the courtyard, which is fantastic. Real lawn, beautiful lush plants also. We have awesome timber bench seating, which you can sit down with a book on a Sunday afternoon with the natural sunlight coming through. It's just fantastic. We're the only apartment on the block to have a timber deck, which is unreal. And we've also got a beautiful timber storage shed, so all your garden tools and your lawnmower can be tucked away and out of the eyesight.
We also have a beautiful table out there for entertaining, which Will actually made himself. It's got the black-hearted sassafras, which we actually won in a challenge. We came first in that one. And yeah, it's just incredible. We've got the black-hearted sassafras with a pane of glass in the middle. Something a little bit different, but also really special to this apartment. And yeah, he did a great job. The workmanship is incredible.
In terms of my personal favourite, it's probably Blackwood. I'm drawn to those darker colours like Blackwood and walnut, and I think when you see the end grain of Blackwood, or a piece of that timber that's got some amazingly figured material, I don't think you can beat it. It certainly sort of permeates my house. Got Blackwood vanities and Blackwood dining room tables, so it's pretty popular. Staff, so I guess when it's going at absolute full noise, we've got about 6 staff going. Normally, if we're on sort of not necessarily go slow, but moderate speed in terms of production, we've got 1 guy on the barge, a guy on the tugboat, and 1 or 2 people on the landing, and then an office manager and a warehouse rep, and sometimes another person might drop down the landing, and one of the guys from the operation, Shane, pops up and manages some of the sales. So we've got a pretty lean team. I do a fair bit of the sales work in Melbourne and Sydney, and talking to the architects and a lot of the designers over there. So it's a pretty lean team in terms of size and scale of that purchasing process. We have tended to move towards a direct marketing mechanism. We originally started off with a single reseller based out of Melbourne, and they're still quite a big stockist. But we've sort of found over time that being able to execute the story and get the right profiles and the right timber for clients has become necessary, that we sell directly. And we found that freight is not that expensive to the point where we can't freight reasonable size products, reasonable size orders around the country. It's not to say that we're not open to a reseller network. It was probably more driven by the amount of volume we had, and trying to manage, if we were going to go down a reseller route, having enough to give critical mass across the country. So I guess I'm a Tassie boy. Grew up in Burnie, northwest coast of Tasmania, and did a year in Launceston, and moved down to Hobart. The west coast area is pretty unique. I mean, you can't find anything like that anywhere else in Australia. It's probably more akin to the west coast, the South Island of New Zealand. It's wild and rugged, with some unique landscape, with unique people to match. And it's a stunning piece of scenery. And I think, in terms of living in Australia and Tasmania specifically, I think access to our wilderness, the bush and the beach is, in my case, I'm in Hobart. I can be up a mountain in snow from half an hour from my house, or I can be on a beach 5 minutes walk down from my house, and I think that's a pretty unique situation in some areas of Australia. So the future of Hydrowood, look, I think it's pretty rosy, to be honest. I can only see, I guess, opportunity where we're seeing governments closing native forestry operations around Australia, and that's arguably not a particularly clever thing to do, but from our point of view, I suppose it provides us with additional markets and opportunities. We are looking to go out to market and raise some capital to supercharge it in terms of the sales and marketing piece and product development, and that's something that's going to be coming out in the next 3 or 4 months. I guess we've got to a point now where the product is out in the market, it's been tested, it's been used in furniture, it's been used in medium and high-end architectural projects, and there's a level of market acceptance. And so we really want to give it the best chance possible to succeed and grow. So sort of stay tuned for that. It's going to be pretty exciting times to see who's interested out there in the market to come and play with us.
So there you have it. Hydrowood, Andrew Morgan. Thanks so much to Andrew for his time in what is a truly fascinating operation that they're running there. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of the Monday Meetup Raw. I'm very interested in your feedback. If you enjoyed it and feel it's a way to go, maybe it is the way of the future in relation to the Monday Meetup. But at this stage, it's not going to be every episode. It'll be just the ones where we have enough content, and will most likely be live interview situations. So again, thanks for watching. Leave some feedback, subscribe, all that jazz that goes along with YouTube. Cheers.